One of the key questions on the first exam is going to ask you about relations between Native Americans and settlers, particularly English settlers. But, we will sometimes I ask the question, compare and contrast the English colonies versus the French or the Spanish colonies. Okay. But in any case, there is a reason to concentrate on conflict between Native Americans and the settlers. So I have a timeline here which shows some of the major Native American uprisings to occur, beginning with the Opochancanoughs uprising in Virginia and going on to about 100 years later, the Yamasee War in South Carolina. And just what I want to do here, all this information can be found in the lectures, but I just want to give you a bird's eye view of the various conflicts between Native Americans and settlers so that you can kind of categorize them together in your mind as you start to prepare for the midterm exam. And of course, there will inevitably be questions about conflict between Native Americans and English settlers on that exam. Let's begin with some early, well, this looks pretty rough, doesn't it? Let's begin with some early conflicts. Virginia, as you know from the lectures, was settled in 1607, and relations between the Native Americans and the English settlers were fairly amicable for a number of reasons. First of all, there were very few English settlers, especially English settlers who survived in Virginia. Virginia was a very rough climate to try and colonize, and as a result, many of them died. The percentage of colonists who came into Virginia and then died because of the climate or because of malaria or because of dysentery far outstripped the number of people who were showing. And in fact, the only reason that Virginia's population didn't just disappear was because Virginia's English population didn't just disappear, was because new settlers were coming in all the time. Originally, relations between the Native Americans and the English were fairly amicable. In Virginia, everyone knows the story of Pocahontas, but like what people really don't understand about the Pocahontas story is that her father of the Powhatan, or the chief of the Seneca, was in fact offering Pocahontas his daughter as an incentive for John Smith to join. Of course, she ultimately marries John Rolfe, but this is John Smith. For John Smith to sort of join the Seneca tribe, because the number of Native Americans in Virginia absolutely dwarfed the number of English settlers who arrived. So this idea that the English came or were able to overpower Native Americans immediately is just simply not true. Native Americans very much outnumbered the British. And in fact, the British in Virginia very much depended upon Native Americans for basic foodstuffs, etc., when they first got there. Now, relations between Powhatan and the English settlers, especially John Smith and John Rolfe, was pretty peaceable. But in 1622, Powhatan died, and his brother, Opochancanoughs, took over the leadership of the Seneca in Native Americans who lived near Jamestown. And as you can see in this lithograph, relations quickly deteriorated. See, there's always a period, or it seems to me like there's always a period when the Native Americans suddenly discover that the Europeans are not going to just stop coming, right? Upon first encountering Europeans, there's so few of them that perhaps the Native Americans don't feel threatened. But by 1620 or so, and especially after the Virginians have developed tobacco as a cash crop, Native Americans realize that the English are not going to stop coming, and that's probably at the heart of this uprising on the part of the Seneca Indians against the Virginians. Relations were also stressed in Massachusetts. Massachusetts was, of course, settled by the Puritans in 1620. And relations with Native Americans were fairly peaceful at first there as well. One of the reasons that relations between the English and the Native Americans in Massachusetts were, again, to use this word, amicable, was because there were not a large population of Native Americans in Massachusetts. In fact, when the Puritans first arrived, they had hoped that Native Americans would be able to help them establish themselves and plant their first crops. but there were very few Native Americans to be found because, in fact, fur traders had spread smallpox to the coast of Massachusetts, Cape Cod, Narragansett, etc., and had largely killed the Native Americans through the disease, smallpox. So when the Puritans arrived there, they're surprised to see that the fields are ready to be cultivated. Clearly, the environment has been cultivated by Native Americans, but there are no Native Americans to be found. The reason being that they had been carried off in a smallpox epidemic. And this is where the story of Squanto and Thanksgiving comes in. Of course, Squanto is one of the last surviving Pawtucket Indians, and he finally encounters the Puritans, helps them get themselves established. This is the story of the first Thanksgiving. But again, it wasn't too long until Native Americans realized that the English were not going to stop coming. Okay, and the English started to spread out beyond Massachusetts into the Connecticut River Valley in particular, and the Connecticut River Valley was home to the Pequot Indians. And the Pequot were fairly rich amongst the Native Americans because they enjoyed very favorable trade relations with the Dutch on Long Island. New York was, of course, originally settled by the Dutch. The Pequots, who enjoyed these good trade relations with the Dutch, had access to goods that other Native Americans in Massachusetts did not. Hence, the other Native Americans, the Narragansett in particular, in Massachusetts were somewhat jealous of the Pequots and their good trade relations with other Native Americans, and they joined up with the British, who wanted Native American land. And ultimately, as you can see in this illustration here, the Puritans with the guns hold the first outer circle surrounding the Pequot village, and beyond that first circle is a second concentric circle of Native Americans who have armed themselves with bows and arrows to assist the Puritans. And indeed, the Puritans did basically commit genocide alongside the Puritans, the Narragansetts, I should say, not, this. Okay, so we can see then that as the English began to want and colonize and settle more territory, this inevitably creates tension with the Native Americans. So this is early. The Pequot Massacre is 1637, Opechancanough is 1622. Let's go on to the 1670s, 1680s, and look what happens in Virginia and Massachusetts then. In the 1670s, we have a major conflict in Virginia known as Bacon's Rebellion. And this starts as a conflict between settlers and Native Americans. The Dogue tribe, and they lived up here in what is today Maryland. Virginians, English settlers had begun to reach into this area here and had begun to settle the northern parts of Virginia, particularly around the Potomac River. Now, the Dogue tribe lived on the other side of the Potomac River, and relations quickly deteriorated. And what sparked the conflict was a time when the Dogue Indians actually crossed over the Potomac River into Virginia and carried off a couple of hogs belonging to a farmer named, I think, David Matthew. In any case, quickly the Virginia militia went up to fight and to try and get the Dogue to make peace. But instead of attacking the Dogue Indians, actually what happens is that this Virginia militia, led by an ancestor of George Washington named John Washington, did not attack the Dogue, but rather attacked the Susquehannock Indians. As you can see, they're just a little bit further up here. Totally different group of people. The Dogue were Algonquin-speaking Indians. The Susquehannock, they were actually Iroquois-speaking Indians who had firearms, and the Iroquois were perhaps the most advanced of the Native American civilizations to be found. And what ends up happening is he provokes a war with the Susquehannock Indians, and the Susquehannock Indians absolutely ravage the frontier communities, all right? And of course, the people that they are attacking tend to be poorer. Now, let me explain. Virginia had been settled mostly by indentured servants. Most of the laborers in Virginia were people who came to Virginia under a contract and promised to work until they were able to pay off their debts and then were emancipated. Now, the thing about Virginia in the early years is that most of the indentured servants who came over and were supposed to serve terms of indenture of around 7 years or so, most of them died because they weren't seasoned. But by the 1670s or 1670s, more Virginia colonists are surviving. Part of that is because they're finally getting away from this malarial swamp, which was Jamestown, probably the unhealthiest choice they could have made of a place to settle. And they're moving beyond the falls of the James and the Rappahannock and the other rivers of Virginia and moving into healthier climates. The thing of it is, though, is that the indentured servants who get emancipated, they want land for themselves. The dream is to come to America and to get land for themselves. And the land that they get is marginal, and it's land which Native Americans believe is theirs, because, of course, it was. And the Native Americans and the indentured servants who are settling these marginal lands are in conflict. And then when John Washington crosses over the Potomac River and attacks the Susquehannock, he incites a general warfare along the frontier of Virginia that pitted indentured servants, ex-indentured servants, I should say, poor farmers living on marginal lands against Native Americans. Okay. At this point, we see the arrival of Nathaniel Bacon. Nathaniel Bacon is a key figure in early Virginia history. He was a new arrival to the colony. He had good connections. He was from a wealthy English family, and he had a plantation near modern-day Richmond, Virginia. Now, the settlers were asking the governor, William Berkeley of Virginia, for help subduing the Native Americans who were attacking in the frontier settlements. And for various reasons, William Berkeley refuses to help the settlers on these marginal areas who are going to war against the Native Americans. There's several reasons why he doesn't want to help. For one thing, he does not want to disrupt the fur trade, which benefits him and his friends. So what happens is Nathaniel Bacon, this parvenu and this new settler in Virginia, sees an opportunity. And what he does is he leads a militia of these disgruntled farmers living on the frontier, and they go to war against the Native Americans. In fact, they're able to ally with some Indians, the Occaneechi Indians, and they get them to attack a Susquehannock camp, which was to the south. And the Bacon and these Occaneechi tribemen attacked the village together. And then, when the Occaneechi fell asleep, Bacon and his men murdered all of their erstwhile Native American allies, right? And then bragged about their prowess as Indian killers upon returning to Henrico County. So, this was a race war on the frontier between settlers, poor settlers, most of them former indentured servants who lived on the most marginal lands in Virginia, and the Native Americans. And generally, Bacon's rebellion reflected a general dissatisfaction on the part of many who lived near the frontier against the elite planters who dominated Virginia. Now, Bacon actually turns back and attacks Jamestown. All right. Now, what had happened is that Berkeley, the governor of Virginia, had asked Bacon to apologize, makes Bacon get down on his knees and apologize for his disobedience and for riling up the frontiersmen against the Native Americans. But then he slips away, summons his followers, marches on Jamestown, and at gunpoint, he turns the tables on the governor, William Berkeley, and forces Berkeley to name him the head of the volunteer militia at gunpoint, compels the legislature to authorize another strike on the Native Americans, and Bacon then burns Jamestown down, forcing Berkeley to flee down the river. Berkeley finds some elite planters who are willing to fight with him, but rebellion is simmering. And what has happened is that these poor frontiers people, under the charge of Nathaniel Bacon, are now going to war against not only Native Americans, but the rich planters of Virginia. So this is both a race war white settlers against Native Americans, and a class war. Poor frontiersmen against the elite planters who had the best lands, the most access to tobacco planting, and of course, were not troubled by Native Americans. In any case, Bacon burned Jamestown down in September, threatened to form an alliance with Maryland and North Carolina and win Dutch support, and things were looking very bad for the colony of Virginia. But as happens, died from dysentery. All right, he got the dysentery probably from his climate, and without leadership, ultimately Bacon's rebellion floundered. Berkeley returned with the British army. 23 rebels were captured and hanged, and the governor was actually summoned to England for not maintaining order, and he died there. Okay, so in any case, nothing really was accomplished by Bacon's rebellion, but it does produce significant changes, because Bacon's rebellion was a war between the poor settlers on the frontier against Native Americans. And when they did not win the support of the rich planters and the governor, who was also a rich planter himself, these frontiersmen turned their guns on the wealthy as well. This was terrifying. It was a social revolt. A social revolt is a revolt or a conflict where one class hopes to improve their station through a violent uprising. And it was a revolt led by recently emancipated indentured servants who saw their opportunities shrinking when they had to move further and further into territory which was dominated by Native Americans. And in fact, they did join Bacon's rebellion in droves and benefited from the plunder that they won from the plantations when they attacked the governor and his friends. Now, even though the revolt was unsuccessful, it did in fact quickly produce change. And that change was basically just to stop importing indentured servants to Virginia. The Virginia elite now saw the indentured servants and the poor whites who lived on the frontier as a threat to their social stability. And what ends up happening is that Virginia instead turns to an enslaved African-descended labor force. Now, the first African indentured servants, as well as enslaved people, had arrived in Virginia. I believe it's 1619. There's various African-American indentured servants, as well as enslaved people who were brought into Virginia. But you see it from this graph here. After Bacon's rebellion, which occurs right around 1676, we see a tremendous uptick in both the white population, but a decline, especially a relative decline, of the white servant population. What happened here? Virginia stopped importing indentured servants because they saw them as a threat to the social hierarchy maintained by the wealthy planters. And what did they use for a labor force instead? Enslaved people of African descent. It's after 1680, as we see the relative decline in the indentured servant population, that we see a turn to Black slavery in Virginia, and that is going to define the labor on the plantation in Virginia until, really until the Civil War. Okay, the end of indenture ended a class difference between white servants and the elite, and obfuscated it with a racial difference between enslaved people of African descent and planters. And in fact, we see a real rise of white supremacy in Virginia afterward, as white men, regardless of their class background, could be seen socializing at barbecues or socializing at cockfights, et cetera, et cetera. Meanwhile, the Black population becomes increasingly marginalized because they are now expected to be plantation laborers and nothing else. And what this does is it creates a real difference between white and Black in the South. Eventually, for people of African origin, even being free was a crime. And what few free people there were in Virginia, free Black people, they were expected to move to another country. In 1662, a law is passed in Virginia which says any child born of an enslaved mother becomes a slave, him or herself, and Black codes quickly followed. Okay, so that's what happens in Virginia. All right, we see that Native American conflict actually produced quite a bit of social conflict as well, which resulted in a transition from a primarily white labor force to a primarily black enslaved labor force.